Hello, this is Vulturefire, and today's video is a guide to the new shrine in Breach Wanderer's Aether Storm Part 3. And this will be a guide to how the shrine works, what all the idols do, all of that stuff. To be clear, this will not be a strategy guide. The goal here is not to tell you how to actually beat the idols. It's a lot more complicated, and it is would be the subject of its own video. This is just explaining how all of it works, explaining what all of the idols do, and talking over some basic just information about that. So we're going to start with just the mechanics of the thing itself, and then the second part of the video, there will be timestamps. We'll be going over each of the idols in detail. So to begin with, what is the shrine? It's a building in town. It's unlocked after you beat Depth 3 for the first time. Until then, you can see it in town, but you cannot click on it. I believe there's going to be one of the hotfix patches to Part 3 will have a message explaining, if you try and click on it when you don't have it unlocked, what you have to do to unlock it. But for now, if you click on it, nothing happens. You just need to beat a Depth 3 run. And as soon as you have done that, the shrine should unlock. The shrine contains idols, and you can enable the idols before a run to increase the difficulty. So when you click on the shrine, you'll see, for the first time, you'll see this. Well, you'll see a tutorial message explaining it, but you'll see this, which is that we have right now 0 out of 3 shrine altars, and we can press upgrade in order to unlock them. So you can buy up to 3 altars. The first one costs 5,000 gold, the second one costs 7,500 gold, and the third one costs 10,000 gold. So that's 22,500 gold in order to unlock 3 altars. Now, you only have to purchase the altars once, and they will just stay unlocked. Invoking the idols that are in the altars is free. Which idol the altar contains is random. And if you choose not to invoke an idol, it just doesn't do anything that run. So unlocking the shrine, you only have to do it once, and unlocking altars does not commit you to the higher difficulty. You can choose, if you try playing with idols and you're like, this is way harder than I want to deal with, you can just not turn them on. Or if you just have a run where you're like, I want to be lazy, you can just keep them off for that run. So the idols that are present in the shrine will randomly change after each run unless you use the locking feature to lock the idols. So right now there are 5 total idols. Again, this is as of I believe the patch actually dropped in early July. The Aether Storm Part 3 update. So we have 5 idols: the Idol of Cruelty, the Idol of Endurance, the Idol of Hunger, Idol of the Hunt, and the Whiteflame Idol. And another note, there is an Easter egg that will allow you to unlock the ability to buy 2 more altars so that you can have all 5 active simultaneously. In this video, when I'm going through mechanics, I will at times mention what happens if you have 4 or 5 idols active. And so I wanted to make sure I clarified. It is possible to do that. It does require you to use an Easter egg. I do have a video on my channel that explains how to do that. I'll link that in the description of this video if you are curious. It is worth noting, though, having 5 active idols does go beyond the intended maximum difficulty, and although it is possible to win a 5 idol run, the game isn't balanced with them in mind. The game is balanced with 3 idols being supposed to be the intended top difficulty right now. So don't leave a negative review if you do 5 idols, and which is the reason that One Day put 5 idols behind an Easter egg, One Day being the dev, is that he had seen other games where said like, this is the highest difficulty we think is balanced, but we know there are people who will want it, so we put up in more difficulties, but they were just unlocked in the game. People would play those higher difficulties. They'd say, wow, these unbalanced difficulties are unbalanced, and they'd leave a negative review. So you know what you're getting into if you do more than 3 idols. It warns you, it will not be a fun time. That's your fault if you do that. Anyway, unlocking altars. So this is what it looks like once you've unlocked all of the altars. We've unlocked 3 out of 3. You can see here the 3 that we have right now are Cruelty, Hunger, and Endurance. It tells you a little bit about them. And you may notice there's no button here to invoke them. So you may be curious, how do you actually use your idols? And the answer is, when you go to start a run, you're on this map screen. Once you go to Depth 3, you'll see a Shrine button. That Shrine button only appears once you are on Depth 3. So if the button doesn't show up, that's why. And also, of course, you have to have the Shrine available to you, so you have to have beaten Adept 3 or up before. So once you click the Shrine button, you can then, you'll see now that we do have the button to invoke. You can press random, which will randomly invoke one of the 3 idols that is visible. You can use that if you just don't want to think, or, pro tip, if you want to invoke all of the idols, the fastest way to do it is just to jam the random button 3 times. There's also, and then once you have invoked all of your idols, you'll now see that they light up, and it now changes from invoke to dismiss. Invoking and dismissing idols, that's completely free. You can turn them on and off before the run as much as you want. Once the run starts, obviously they are either on or off. You can't change it mid-run. But if you don't want to use idols, you just turn them off. If you do want to use idols, you turn them on. And when you go back to the screen, you'll notice that when we select the Mushroom Forest, you can now see that there are 2 idols that are active for the area. And so this is one of the things that we will get into, is that just because all the idols are invoked doesn't mean they are active in every area. I'll get into what that means in a moment. The other thing I want to talk about real quick is locking idols. So let's say that you want to test your deck and refine it against a specific combo of idols. You know, you're like, I have seen Hunt, Endurance, Hunger as the ones that are up right now. And you're like, I want to keep refining my deck until I can beat this combo. You can lock the idols before your run, which costs 1,000 gold. And if you do that, they will not be randomly shuffled after the run, and you can keep trying that same combo until you run out of gold or decide you don't want to keep them blocked, or you just get bored of it, whichever. So what does invoking an idol do? Each area will have 1 or more active idols depending on the number you have invoked. And this is where I was talking about on the map screen. You can see that there were 2 active. If you've invoked 1 or 2 idols, there will be 1 idol that is active in each area. If you have invoked 3 or 4 idols, there will be 2 idols active in each area. If you invoke 5 idols, there will be 3 idols active in each area. The invoked idols that are not active in an area will still apply their passive effect, but they won't augment any fights. I'll talk about what that means in a moment. But so this is the important thing, is that in this screenshot, we saw previously we have Hunt, Endurance, and Hunger, but only Hunt and Hunger are in Area 1, but the Endurance passive of 20% more health and shield on all enemies, that is still going to be in effect in Area 1, even though Idol of Endurance is not one of the active idols. Another note, some of the fights in each area, as mentioned, will be augmented by active idols. These fights are indicated by the idols icon appearing next to the fight node, which, if you look here, this one we have the Endurance icon and the Whiteflame icon because this fight is augmented by both. This fight is augmented by Endurance. This fight is augmented by Endurance. This fight has a Icy Gale Weather effect, but it is not actually augmented by an idol at all. Same with, this one is Idol of Whiteflame. You can just see it under the legend here. This one is also not augmented at all. So yeah, you can see how many idols. So the number of augmented fights is somewhat random, but boss fights are always augmented. In a 1 or 2 idol run, I didn't mention it here, but if there's only 1 active idol in the area, obviously, and boss fights are always augmented, and that includes both mid bosses and end bosses. Obviously, the 1 idol that is active is the one that's augmenting both the mid bosses and the end boss. In a 3 idol run, which is, again, remember, 2 active idols in the area, each of them will augment one of the 2 mid bosses. So in this example, where we have Endurance and Whiteflame, one of the mid bosses would have been augmented with Endurance, one was augmented with Whiteflame. If you have a 4 idol run, both active idols augment both mini bosses in addition to the final boss. So if the run that I have been going back to was a 4 idol run, then both of the mid bosses would have been augmented by both Whiteflame and Endurance. And in a 5 idol run, all 3 active idols will augment both mini bosses and the end boss. Or it says mid bosses. So 5 idol runs are a huge step up in difficulty from 4 because you have 1 more active idol in the area, and you then have to deal with all 3 of them in all boss fights. And that makes the first mid-boss fight in particular really painful. Like I said, not intended to be balanced, and if you're curious, it's fun to try. It's just not easy. So what does augmenting a fight mean? Because I've said that a whole lot, that things augment fights. If an idol is augmenting a fight, there are a few things that are going to happen that are going to make the fight more challenging for you. The first one is each of the idols just straight out enemies are 20% more. They do 20% more damage. They have 20% more health and shield. They heal themselves for 20% more. They will generate 20% more trash cards. And this is per idol. So 2 active idols, that's 40% better at everything. So 40% more damage, etc. This modifier is applied before damage modifiers, such as mighty or tough. So that means that, for example, if you have 2 idols active, that's 40% bonus. Mighty enemy does 25% more damage. 1.4 times 1.25 equals 1.75. So that is 75% more damage than the same enemy would do if it wasn't mighty and wasn't augmented by idols. The other thing is, with the exception of the Idol of Cruelty, for reasons that we'll get into later, each idol has a combat passive that takes effect from the moment the fight starts. So the Idol of Endurance, for example, causes all enemies to start with several ranks of Fortress. We'll get into what all of the passives are when we're getting into each idol. And so if you see that you are going to have to do a fight that has the Idol of Endurance, you'll need to be able to deal with that extra damage reduction on all enemies from the start of the fight. The other thing is, after the end of the monster turn, each active idol will play one of its idol cards. If you've played a weather fight, this is very similar to that. If you've done weather fights, you know that you have the monsters take their turn, then weather does a thing, and then it's back to your turn. And in this case, if you have weather and idols, then it goes weather cards, idol cards, and then back to the player turn. So more correctly, the full turn order, I guess, is the player summons, the enemies, the weather, the idol, and then that's it. And then you repeat. So when you're looking at an idol card, the text will tell you what exactly the card does, but as a general shorthand, the card border rarity will tell you how bad this is for you. If the idol card has a bronze border, it's a common, then that effect is going to be entirely bad for you. If it's a silver card, then it's going to affect both you and your enemies usually, or it will just have a mix of positive and negative effects on you. It's usually a little bit more of a hindrance than a help, but that's not a hard and fast rule, and it obviously depends on the situation, on your deck, etc. Gold cards are intended to be a huge upside for the player. Sometimes that doesn't quite work out to be true, but it usually does. Normally, you see a gold card and you're pretty happy. The other note is, with the exception of the Idol of Cruelty, which does not have an epic card, none of the Idol of Cruelty cards are really good for you. Each idol has 5 commons, 2 rares, and 1 epic. And the epic will never show up in the first few turns. It is a deliberate balance choice that it was changed so that if you're watching some of my videos, the other note here is a lot of the videos I'm going to be releasing around the same time as this were recorded during the beta. And things change a lot over the course of the beta. So anything I say here is based on the release version, which may differ from what you see in my other videos. But anyway, the idol has to play each of its cards once before it can repeat any of them. I'm not sure if the epic is always the last card in the deck, but it's at least guaranteed to be like turn 5 or later. So you don't have the chance of just rolling all of the epic cards from the augmenting idol on turn 1 and just having a super easy fight. You will have to struggle. So here's an example of what that looks like. You can see that it is a common card, creates 1 eroded voidstone on top of your deck, and then this card is removed from the deck, so it will not be played again. And what is an eroded voidstone? We'll get into that later. So what do you get for winning an augmented fight? Because obviously the question is, if not all fights are augmented, why would you go into augmented fights? And the first reason is that fights augmented by idols offer a chance to pick up the relevant reward cards. Just like weather effects, the reward cards, they're not the same as cards that are played by the idol during the fight. These are separate cards that are sort of inspired by what the idol works with, but aren't directly the same as the cards that are played during the fights. Also, each idol has a total of 6 reward cards, 2 for each rarity. Unlike weather, where with weather there are just 3 cards per weather, and that you get those regardless of what kind of fight it is. With idol cards, there are 2 per rarity, and it will match the rarity of the monster card offered. So in a boss fight, you will get offered the gold ones. In an elite fight, you'll be offered the silver ones. In a normal fight, you'll be offered the commons. And this is offered as a totally separate option. It is not in the same set of drops as the weather cards or the monster cards or your card pool. It is a separate thing. I will show you that in a moment. And if there is a weather active in an idol augmented fight, then you will only be offered 1 card from your card pool, in addition to 1 monster card, 1 weather card, and 1 idol card. And likewise, if you are playing Inna, who is level 7, because of interface limitations, there's only room for 4 cards on the screen. So you end up not being sort of losing the effect of the Inna level 7 passive, unfortunately. We can see here as an example, we have 2 of the cards from the card pool. We have the monster card, and then we have the idol card. And so because this was an elite fight, as you can see, because this is a silver card, the idol card is also a silver rare card. And so what else do you get? If the augmented fight wasn't a boss fight, you'll receive a passive buff for the rest of the run. The idea here is boss fights are non-optional. You have to take them, so there's no need for there to be extra rewards for beating boss fights. This is already supposed to be a challenge mode. You knew what you were getting into. But if you do decide to up the challenge further and hit fights that are augmented by idols, which will be quite a bit harder, especially if there are multiple idols affecting the same fight, then you will get a special reward that is a buff, and you'll get 1 buff per idol augmenting the fight. Some buffs are particularly strong. These are going to be on the next page, which is the list of buffs highlighted in green. These strong buffs can only appear in fights augmented by at least 2 idols, which means that because only 3 idol runs will have 2 idols active in the same area, you can only get these buffs in 3 idol runs, or more idols than that. If you do get one of these, you'll get 1 fewer total buff, because like I said, these are stronger buffs. They take up 2 buffs worth of space. The buffs that you do receive are completely random. It is not related to the idols augmenting the fight. You have the same chance to get, plus crit chance if you're fighting Hunt as you do against Cruelty, even though Hunt has critical themes. It is also possible to receive the same buff multiple times in a run, and if you do, they will stack. So, for example, we'll start getting into the list of buffs, like +2 starting mana. If you get that buff 3 times, then you now have 6 additional mana at the start of turn 1 of each fight. So, the full list of buffs. You have +2 starting mana, which is just how much mana you have on turn 1 of the fight. The base amount you get is 2. That's the normal default 2 plus your mana per turn. And then this will up it to then 4 plus your mana per turn, or more than that, depending. You can also just get +4 max mana, which isn't the most useful thing, but it's fine. +1 mana per turn, which is one of our 2 particularly strong buffs. So if you get +1 mana per turn, that is worth 2 buffs, which makes sense because that is very strong. +15 max health, +5 recoverable health, which is how much health you can lose before your cap decreases. That's kind of the gap you can have between your current health and your max recoverable before it starts dropping. +2 health restored after combat. So this is added to the Mindbot item or the Forge upgrade. So this is health you get immediately after the fight ends, and this healing ignores the recoverable health cap, or more accurately, it increases your recoverable cap by just as much. So if you were at like 30 out of 30 because you had lost a bunch of health, after the fight you'll be at 32 out of 32. +4 max shield, which of course will also increase how much shield you start the fight with and how much you can keep between turns. +2 shield gained, which means that any time you play a card that gains, for each time a card gains you shield, non-fixed shield, you will get 2 more than you would have otherwise. This adds up. This is incredibly useful, especially if you have things like Mana Shield Plus or Shielded Strike that gain shield multiple times. -1 damage taken. This is kind of like plated, but only for damage. It doesn't affect status. And it just is an invisible buff. Not invisible, it shows up on your character sheet, but it is just a buff that is helpful for helping you take less damage. +5% evade chance. That's right, it's possible to reach 100% evade with Hidden again if you get enough good luck. Because you just need all of the right items and roll +5% evade chance a few times. +3 max frost, arcane, and shock. This is the thresholds that you need to trigger these statuses on the player. So, for example, it means that if you have this buff once, then instead of needing 10 arcane for you to eat an arcane detonation, you will need 13. And it'll go up from 13 to 15 and so on, up to a max of 23 will be the limit. +2 status decay per turn. Normally, you would lose 1 frost, 1 arcane, and 1 shock from your status bars at end of turn. This will increase that to 3 or more. To 3 if you get it once, and then this will also stack with the Purifying Shard item, which has the same effect. You have +1 damage dealt, which is pretty straightforward. You do more damage with all of your non-fixed damage sources. +5% damage dealt. This will stack additively with your other buffs like Mighty or hitting things that are vulnerable and so on. Plus 5% critical chance. Straightforward enough. Plus 2 status applied. Like I said, similar to how various items currently work, where you just, everything that you do that applies non-fixed status now applies more of it. Plus 10% status applied. Just like with the damage dealt bonus, this will stack additively with things like adept and vulnerable. Plus 2 max hand size. So the base max hand size is, of course, 10. And this lets you hold more cards before you run out of space in your hand. Lets you have really large hands. Plus 1 starting cards drawn. So this is your cards drawn on turn 1. So normally you draw 5 cards at the start of turn 1, plus potentially 1 from Wits or 1 from Route and level 10. And with this, you can just start the turn holding all the cards. Plus 1 fatigue threshold. So this means that instead of needing 5 cards drawn to get 1 rank of fatigue, you can draw 6 cards before getting 1 rank of fatigue. This is the second of the powerful buffs that takes up 2 spots instead of 1. And it is very strong indeed, especially if you're dealing with Idol of the Hunt, which is going to, because this counteracts the Idol of the Hunt's passive to reduce your fatigue threshold. The last 3 affect specific buffs and debuffs. The first one is that your Adept, Mighty, and Tough, and this is only yours, this doesn't affect Adept, Mighty, and Tough on your allies or on enemies. All of those 3 buffs are 5% stronger. So Adept will go up to being 30%, Mighty will go up to 30%, Tough will go up to being 30%. Or if you're Inna, they're now up to 40%. And you can get other ways to increase that as well. Plus 5% weak, frail, and vulnerable effects on enemies. So same deal, weak, frail, vulnerable, go from 25% to 30%, or more if you get this more than once. And the last one is minus 5% weak, frail, and vulnerable effects on self. So instead of doing 25% less damage, you could do 20% less damage. It is actually theoretically possible, although I don't know that anybody has done it, but because there are a couple items that also reduce weak, frail, vulnerable effects on self by 10%, I believe it's possible to get below 0% penalty. So weak and frail or weak and vulnerable would actually be net bonuses. If you were to roll this twice and get both of the items that reduce the effectiveness of weak, frail, and vulnerable on self, you could get minus 30%, which would mean that weak is then a plus 5% damage buff for you. So how else do idols affect the run? You get more ether, gold, and XP. Specifically, I didn't know about this until I was talking to One Day about it. The way that it works is that augmented fights are increased by 50% in their rewards for each augmenting idol. So in a 3-idol fight, that means you're getting twice as much ether, gold, and XP from each end boss you beat, because they'll always have 2 idols affecting them. Invoking idols also increases the chance for weather effects to appear. I am pretty sure, although I didn't double check this, that with enough idols invoked, it is possible for an area to have more than 2 weather effects present. Because the idea here is that weather is another sort of way to make the game harder. So more idols and more weather effects increases the chance that you're going to have things like having to deal with mid bosses that have an idol and a weather effect, which can be pretty nasty. And so that's something to be aware of. So that is all the general information. Hopefully now you have a pretty good handle on how exactly your idols work. If you don't, probably you're just going to have to watch one of my runs that has it or play your own run, and that should help you get up to speed. But now it's time to go into detail, going through one idol at a time in alphabetical order, just talking about what exactly they do. And so there are 3 things for each idol. And so Idol of Cruelty will be the first one we're going to talk about, and we'll also sort of explain how this is going to be structured. So first of all, the global passive, which is Invoke the Spirit of Cruelty, increasing the damage dealt and status applied by enemies and debuffs by 20%. So the global passive is, of course, the thing that the idol has that affects everything, all fights, whether or not the idol is active. And so for Idol of Cruelty, this is a 20% damage buff and 20% status applied buff for both enemies and debuffs. This is a base increase. It applies additively with plus 20% augmentation bonus that the idols provide during fights. But of course, it is also, because it's a global passive, active during fights that aren't augmented by idols. Despite the wording, the damage is increased for all debuffs on the player regardless of source. So self-applied burn and poison will also deal 20% more damage. And to be clear, this does increase the fixed damage and status that is done by debuffs. So, for example, Leech will be 4 damage to you. And if you have, and because of how it's rounded, because it is rounded to the nearest whole number, that means that 3 rounds up to 4. So if you have Arcane Link 3 or Bleed 3, then you will get 4 Arcane or 4 damage per non-mana card played. So be very careful fighting Idol of Cruelty, because one of its cards that we're going to talk about applies Arcane Leak to you. And if you are just doing math in your head, it is very easy to get thrown off and not realize that you're getting more Arcane than you expected. because that 20% does hurt. Idol of Cruelty is the only one that doesn't have a combat passive, just has stronger cards. Specifically, as we talked about, it doesn't have an epic rarity card, but also its other cards can be particularly brutal to a lot of decks. So let's get into those. So this is the third section. So this would be the second section for most idols, but Idol of Cruelty doesn't have a combat passive. So now we're going to get into the active cards. So you'll notice there are a lot of cards here. I've said that idols have 7 or 8 cards, depending on, this one has 7, all other idols have 8. The reason that you have more than that is that this is based on what area it's in. So the first one card in a set of 3 is the card for area 1, the second one's for area 2, the third one's for area 3. So starting with these commons, we have gain enfeebled 1. When it says, so these are written from the perspective as though you had played it. So when it says, although that is inconsistent between these two, that bugs me a little bit. Anyway, I may complain about that. But so yeah, gain enfeebled 1 in week 1, enfeebled 2 week 2, enfeebled 3 week 3. So just enfeebled is a new debuff that reduces your damage and status modifiers by half. So you get half as much benefit from Mighty, half as much benefit from Adept, etc. This also includes stuff on the enemies. You get half as much benefit from hitting enemies that are vulnerable. But it also has the effectiveness of weak as well, because it doesn't matter whether your modifiers are positive or negative, it enfeebled halves them. So this is kind of funny to me because by default, this is less of an impact than if it had just applied weak and not both. But assuming you have basically any damage buffs, this will be, enfeebled will be worse than just having the weak, especially because enfeebled cannot be cleansed. Next one. This one makes you worse at dealing damage. This one makes you much more susceptible to damage. This is, you get vulnerable, you get frail, you get crystallize. Crystallize is a new stacking debuff that you take 5% more damage and 5% more status for each rank, and it does not decrease at end of turn. So in Area 3, when Idol of Cruelty plays this, you will now be taking 15% more damage and status for the rest of the fight, in addition to, if you can't cleanse it off, up to 25% more from vulnerable if you haven't gotten any ways to reduce that vulnerable effectiveness. This card is one of the cards of Idol of Cruelties that is removed, and it is kind of painful. It is you gain Curse 4, or in Area 2 it is Curse 3 2 times. And the reason it is twice is so that it hits Purity harder, so it's harder to block out with Purity. And likewise, the Area 3 effect is Curse 4 2 times. So this is one of those things where if you are a slower deck, you really want to have access to Cleanse, especially even in like Area 1, because that 8 damage a turn can absolutely be pretty brutal. And it's actually more than 8 because it's 8 times 1.2, which is, I can't do math in my head, 9 or 10. Shrug. I'm too lazy to actually figure out whether it's 9 or 10 damage, but it's a decent amount. It also, Idol of Cruelty can just straight up apply enough arcane to you to trigger a detonation. Now, even though this says applied arcane to yourself, it is not fixed arcane. Merly can evade it, and Tough and Plated, etc. will reduce it. However, Vulnerable and Crystallize will increase it. So be very careful. It is worth noting the 20% bonus does not, to monsters, etc., does not increase the amount of arcane that is applied by the idol card, because that would just be double dipping. That wouldn't be. So like these cards only are showing up in Idol of Cruelty, so there's no reason for them not to just list the number that they do. So another thing that's kind of all idols have is these idol stones, and they're all called adjective something stone. So this is a Sinister Runestone. It is the Idol of Cruelty one. And so the card that creates them is removed after play because the stone itself is not removed on play. In order to get rid of idol stones, you're going to need to have some way to transform them into something else, which means something like a Reforge or Turn to Gunk or Calculated Deception. So these are a large part of the reason why I really like having Reforge in my anti-idol decks. Is because I really like having a way to get rid of these idol stones. This one in particular this is one of the two that I think is really, really obnoxious, because it is, the Sinister Runestone is 1 mana, skill, rare, the rarity doesn't matter. You gain Fatigue 1 when it's drawn, and you apply 6 fixed arcane to yourself and draw 2 when you play it. the earliest version of this applied Arcane to you on draw. It was brutal. It has been toned down slightly since. Theoretically, it is a 1-mana draw too, but applying Arcane to yourself is very risky against the Idol of Cruelty because, it can apply more Arcane to you and detonate you. And also, as long as this is in your deck, you'll sometimes just draw into Fatigue on turn 1, which really isn't great. And if you are, and in Area 3, you get 2 of them in an Idol of Cruelty fight. So the rares, the first one is Arcane Weakness and Arcane Leak. So, that. In Area 1, this is only Arcane Weakness, which makes it a pretty negligible effect, honestly. The Arcane Weakness 2 is basically, because the only way that Arcane is getting triggered is these, as long as you're not fighting enemies that apply Arcane, this is fine. However, it does mean that if you're fighting Idol of Cruelty, certain Area 1 enemies like the Vessel of Knowledge or Lore Blossoms can become quite a bit more dangerous just because you will have more Arcane Weakness. In Area 2 and 3, this will apply Arcane Leak. In Area 2, it's Arcane Leak 2, and Area 3 is Arcane Leak 4, which, as discussed, will get bumped up by 1, so that is 5 Arcane for every non-mana card you play. And that's Arcane Weakness 2 that you just picked up, so you're going to have a bad day. You really want to avoid... You really want to know that this is a possibility and that you could just effectively lose a turn to this, because even if you have Cleanse, you need a lot of Cleanse in order to get through it in Area 3. The other silver... So it does also apply Arcane Leak to enemies, but you're unlikely to be able to really use that because Arcane Leak on you is usually going to be a bigger problem than Arcane Leak on enemies, unless you can either cleanse it off or you had enough purity to block the Arcane Leak from getting applied to you at all. Then you have the Idol of the other silver card, which is just everyone gains Crystallize, 2, 3, 4. So that's 10% more, 15% more, 20% more. So, as mentioned, there's no gold cards, so there's only these 7. And 2 of them are removed after they're played, which means that, in effect, you'll see the other cards once every 5 turns. When you're fighting Idol of Cruelty, having access to a good amount of Cleanse is pretty important. You really want to be able to get rid, even if you can't get rid of the Arcane Leak, you want to be able to try and ideally get rid of the Arcane Weakness before you have Arcane applied to you. You also want to be able to get rid of the Crystallized and Vulnerable, and you want to be able to get rid of that Curse. So Cleanse is very important against Idol of Cruelty. 1 Idol down, 4 to go. Idol of Endurance. Invoke the Spirit of Endurance, the global passive. You invoke the Spirit of Endurance, which increases the health and shield of all enemies by 20%. This is pretty straightforward. Base increase. Same deal as with Idol of Cruelty. This applies additively with 20% augmentation bonus during idol fights. However, unlike the augmentation bonus, this only affects the health and shield that enemies start the fight with. If the enemy gains shield or if they heal during a fight, that's not boosted by this passive. This is only their starting health and shield. Combat passive. Enemies start combat with ranks of Fortress. Number of ranks spent on the area. In Area 1 it's 4, in Area 2 it's 5, in Area 3 it is 6. Fortress is not a new buff, but it has changed. The new version of Fortress is things with Fortress take 10% less damage per rank of Fortress. It is worth noting there is a soft cap on 70% damage reduction. So if the other thing is that minus 70%, that minus 10% per rank of Fortress is added to any increased damage they take, like Vulnerable or Mighty and so on. So that's how you can sort of mitigate it, is that if you stack a lot of buffs, plus damage percent buffs of your own, you can overcome the Fortress. But if you are just trying to do, if you aren't doing that, you're just trying to use like Powerful and you're not trying to get percentage increases, it's going to be pretty brutal, because that means that Fortress does decay by 1 every turn. But this does mean that, that 4 Fortress means that in Area 1 even, that's 40% less damage that enemies are taking on turn 1. Area 2 is 50% less. Area 3 is 60% less. So that is a substantial hindrance to your aggro deck if you aren't playing something like... K'Tan can usually generate enough Vengeance to try and get over that. But Sharu, who's usually trying to stack Powerful, will usually struggle a bit more. It also makes Arcane particularly useful for stripping that off. because the other note here is Fortress only affects damage. It does not affect status, unlike Tough and Plated. So you can bypass Fortress's reduction with by directly applying Arcane, and that will help you blow it up. So Idle Endurance is active cards. The first one is one of the removed cards. It divides shield and powerful equally among all enemies. This can be pretty brutal in boss fights. If there's only one enemy and they just get this 5, 6, or 8 powerful, that can be pretty devastating, especially if it's an enemy that can hit a lot of times. The shield part usually isn't that big of a deal compared to powerful. Ideally, in a wider fight, this tends to be less of a problem. The other note here is like when it says divide equally, it will literally divide and then it will round as necessary. So 6 powerful divided among 4 enemies, 6 divided by 4 is 1.5, which rounds up to 2. So it turns out if you split 6 powerful among 4 enemies, you actually give out 8 powerful, which is, I would say, unfair, but I'm not one day. One of the other common cards is you lose a bunch of shield and some evasion. I do find this one kind of funny. It's very rare to actually lose evasion to it because it's very difficult for basically any character to stack non-temporary evasion. So there have been a couple of times where I've actually lost non-temporary evasion and it mattered. But most of the time, even if you lose evasion, it's evasion that you were losing at the start of your next turn anyway. So whatever. This one, all enemies gain Frost Barrier and then in Area 2 and 3, they also gain Reflect. This is something to be aware of if you're doing a multi-hit deck. Again, Arcane. You want Arcane to deal with Fortress. You want Arcane to deal with the Frost Barrier and the Reflect, because otherwise you risk freezing yourself. Of course, getting frozen isn't as big of a deal as it used to be. You don't lose the rest of your turn. It just negates the next 2 cards you play. But also, Frost on the player now only upticks by 2 instead of by 5, so accidentally refreezing yourself is much easier. One more common. You divide Purity equally among all enemies, and you give them Fortress. So the Fortress is not divided. So one of the things that can happen here is that this is Fortress 2, 3, 4. In Area 3, I mentioned they start with 6 Fortress. Then on the second, if this gets played on turn 1, then going into turn 2, all damage, which will be, thanks to the soft gap, reduced to like 75% or something like that. I'm too lazy to get the exact number right now. But that means that obviously that is a lot less damage. So you really need percentage damage bonuses to overcome that, or you need to be able to otherwise circumvent the Fortress. Also, this Purity obviously can be a real nuisance, especially again if there's only one enemy and that enemy in Area 3 just picked up 4 Purity. That can be quite a lot for debuff-based decks to deal with. So now we have the Idol of Endurance's Idol Stone, which is the Eroded Void Stone. So similar to a lot of these, the progression is you shuffle one in, you create one on top of your deck in Area 2, and then in Area 3 you just shuffle 2 of them into your deck. And so the effect of this one is it is by far the least annoying to have because it is 2 mana, discard 2, draw 2. And to be clear, that draw is not conditional on the discard. If this is the last card in your hand, you can just pay 2 mana and draw 2. However, having it be the last card in your hand is trickier in idle fights because you're likely to have the idle reward cards. I forgot to put in the idle reward cards here. That's the part that this video is missing. I'll add it in post, or it'll be separate. It's going to be a separate video. This video is going to be long enough. But because the idle reward cards have retained, and that means that they will stick around between turns, you often won't necessarily want to discard your entire hand to play out your entire hand and then play a Eroded Voidstone, but it's an option. Idol of Endurance has some of the friendliest cards. It doesn't have any cards that just outright punch the player. It doesn't have any cards that are this card is the closest it gets to outright punching you, and it's never going to actually hit your health. So Idol of Endurance tends to be pretty nice. These stones, easily the least obnoxious of the stones. It doesn't really have a direct downside aside from the fact that it costs you a draw. The Sinister Stone fatigues you when you draw it. This one doesn't do that. It doesn't have any negative effects on just having it. The 2 silver cards, one of them is just, the first tier is draw 2, discard 1. And this is not going to be your turn, so most likely you will, if you didn't have any retained cards, then the 2 cards you draw will probably be the only cards in your hand, so you just basically pick one of those 2. This is actually, I think, really good. I think this is just straight upside. This is a silver card, but it is less good than the gold card, but this is basically pure upside for the most part, unless you've been manipulating your deck in some way. This is just, you get one more card than you would have otherwise. There are times where you're like, I wanted to draw both of these next turn, but the fact that you just have an extra card, and likewise with the draw 3, discard 2, draw 4, discard 3, like, yes, you will often be discarding cards you wanted to draw, because if your deck is well constructed, you want to draw the cards in your deck. But fundamentally, the way to look at it is, if you get this card, you now have one more card this turn than you would have gotten otherwise. The Idol of Endurance, the other Silver Idol of Endurance card is everyone gains plated this turn, and then it's 8, and then 10, and then 10, and also Fortress 5. So if you're a defensive deck, this tends to be great, because this turn's free. Because of how powerful how much idols tend to buff enemies, this is unlikely to be a completely 0 damage turn. But this is a substantial amount of breathing room and can be very, very nice. This is another one of the cards. It's like, this is technically symmetrical, but at least for the decks I play, I'm usually happier to see it than not. And then the gold endurance card, which is the first gold card we've seen, because Cruelty, of course, did not have a gold card. This one is, you get Fortress 3 and Powerful 2, or Fortress 3 and Powerful 3, or Fortress 4 and Powerful 4. So you get some powerful, you get a solid chunk of damage reduction. And that's just obviously very useful. Especially if you have some problems with scaling, this will help you scale a bit to deal with some of the enemy, to get a little bit more damage out, a little bit more status out, just all that good stuff. So that was Idol of Endurance. On to Idol of Hunger. So the Idol of Hunger invoked the spirit of Heist Boss, Devourer of Gods, giving lifesteal 4 to all enemies and converting their overkill into shields. This is the global passive. Lifesteal 4 means that enemies will heal for 40% damage to deal with attacks, because it's 10% healing per point of lifesteal. Lifesteal doesn't decrease each turn, but it can be dispelled, either with cards that directly dispel or just by causing arcane detonations. So this is global passive. This is all fights in all areas, as long as you have the idol invoked. The combat passive. So, Berserk. At the start of combat, all enemies gain a permanent rank of Berserk 1. Enemies that have Berserk don't die when they are killed. Instead, they lose all ranks of powerful, and they can't get any health or shield, and they're going to die at the end of their next normal turn. And only normal turns count. If you trigger their action early with Opportunist, or if you just have goading cards just trigger the enemy action, that's not going to count to kill a berserking enemy. They have to take a normal turn. Or if they're frozen, then that also will work, but it has to be the monster turn. The berserk check happens after the enemy action, but before they take damage from debuffs. So if they hit 0 health by attacking into Reflect, for example, they will die that turn. But if they hit 0 health from something like Curse or Poison, then they don't die until after their next turn. So basically, they have to spend a turn at 0 health, or they have to end an action at 0 health in order to die. Fortunately, enemies that are summoned during combat, whether that's by the player or another enemy, do not have Berserk. If an enemy has Rebirth, only the first form has Berserk. So, for example, with the Gargoyle bosses in the Battered Ramparts, only the initial Gargoyle Sentry has Berserk. The Damaged Gargoyle and Broken Gargoyle phases do not. However, Berserk can't be dispelled or removed in any way. You just have to deal with it. So this is only the fights that Hunger is augmenting, but it is an annoyance. And the player loses ties. If you killed Baelator, but Baelator kills you on its Berserk turn, you still lose. You still died. Even though Baelator went down right after you, that's still a loss. So, the active cards. Start with, I guess, just for fun, we'll start with the removed card. All enemies heal for 15% of their maximum health. Oh, did I mention? I don't think I mentioned in this one, really, that overheal is converted to shields. That's going to be relevant here in a moment. So if an enemy is at full health and they heal, they get 1 shield for every point of healing. Okay, back to this. So all enemies heal for 15% of their maximum health. So, like I said, if they had 100 health, then they heal for 15. And if they were already at full health, they will get the shields instead. This goes to heal for 10% of their max health and then increase by max health by 5%. And then the final tier is they heal for 10% of their max health and they increase their max health by 10%. The increased max health actually tends not to be that much different than them just healing. Even life-stealing enemies usually aren't going to be healing back to full that often. So the other ones, all enemies gain tough 2, or tough 3, or tough 3. Divide temporary opportunists equally among them. This is important. The Idol of Hunger is one of the 2 idols that hands out opportunist, but it only hands out temporary opportunist. This means that all of those ranks go away after a single turn. This is very, very important for being able to deal with Idol of Hunger efficiently. It's just knowing that you can afford to waiting out the opportunist is very much a thing you can do and a thing that is easy to do. You also have a card that divides powerful and lifesteal among all enemies. If an enemy gets enough lifesteal, they will start healing more than, like, if you have 11 stacks of lifesteal, then you heal for 110% of the damage you dealt. So if you did 10 damage, you'd heal for 11. So that's fun. That enemies will just get a lot of healing off of their hits. Of course, the player's usually doing a lot more damage than the enemies, even when you're having a really bad time. Like, even against Baylator, which is the hardest hitting monster in the game, you should still be hitting for more damage than Baylator is. But it can slow you down some. And the powerful, and especially because this is not a removed card, unlike the Idol of Endurance card we were looking at, this can stack up a lot of powerful on enemies. The other one is punch the player in the face. Take 10 damage, 17 damage, 25 damage. This is something you need to be aware as possible because this is a substantial amount of damage. It can be reduced by tough and by plated and by fortress, but this is a substantial amount of damage that can just come out of nowhere and make your day much worse. And this can be affected by vulnerable and by frail and by shocked. You can have a real bad time if you, like in the Wildstorm weather, for example, and that Wildstorm weather shocks you, and then Idol of Hunger comes along, and it's like, take 50, and then you are like, ouch, and you die, and that's sad. So be prepared to die, I guess. Normally it won't kill you, but it will, hurt. So the last of the common cards is, of course, the Idol Stone card. This is the other Idol Stone that I really want the ability to reforge or otherwise transform, because the Insidious Power Stone is unplayable. When you draw it, you draw a card to replace it, and you give Powerful 1 to all enemies, and you draw it whenever an ally or enemy dies. So playing summons into Idol of Hunger is super risky if you can't consistently transform the Power Stones, because every time one of your summons dies, all the enemies are getting Powerful 1. And every time you kill it, fighting things like Shadow Bursts, you kill a Shadow Burst from Watcher of the Swarm, every enemy gets Powerful 1. You really want to be able to transform this. The other thing is, like, if the enemies are Berserk, like, you'll kill a Berserk enemy, it will die on its turn, you'll draw Insidious Power Stone when it's not your turn, and then potentially other enemies will have that extra powerful by the time they take their turn. The sequencing on things that do things when drawn, when it's the monster turn, can be kind of awkward, and I think is somewhat dependent on whether you're playing with fast mode enabled, which is a little awkward, but it is what it is. The higher tiers of this also cause you to gain Frail 2, but it goes shuffle one in, and give the player Frail 2, and shuffle 2 of these jerks in and then you get Frail 2. So that means Powerful 2 every time to all enemies every time stuff dies. You do also draw 2 cards, but that is usually less of a concern than how much powerful stacking you're giving. This one, gain Bleed 2, divide Bleed 4 equally among all enemies. Bleed 3, divide Bleed 6 among all enemies. Bleed 4, divide Bleed 8 equally among all enemies. This tends to be more manageable than the Arcane leak from Cruelty, because it's usually a lot easier to sustain the damage from bleed if necessary. Whereas like the arcane weakness means that the arcane leak will like devastate your any buff stacks you had, while also doing a bunch of damage to you. Whereas like the bleed you can more easily mitigate, and you're less likely to just like back into a corner where it's like I can't even play one card without suffering. In particular, like you can always play a Sanctuary into having bleed 4. You can't always play a Sanctuary into having arcane leak 4. The other silver card. And the other thing is like if you can manage to bleed on yourself, of course, this is a decent amount of bleed on enemies, and you can get a decent amount of damage out that way by just playing through it as hard as you have a decent amount of defensive cards. Another one. The other silver card. Sorry. Anyway, you put 2 shrivels on top of your deck, or for the third one, you put 3 shrivels on top of your deck. You're going to get powerful this turn, and then the tier 1 and 2 ones are going to give you lifesteal 2 this turn, and the third one is going to give you one rank of non-temporary lifesteal. So that means that for the first 2, you get 1 turn of 20% damage dealt converted into health, and for the last one, you get, for the rest of the fight, 10% of damage dealt converted into health. Because this is a turn moved card, if you draw the fight out long enough, you can get even more lifesteal, or, as with, and this is true of the lower ranks as well, if you empower it, temporary ranks of buffs, if you empower them, the empowered ranks are non-temporary. So you can keep around lifesteal and use that as a way to heal up pretty easily. Finally, we have the gold card, which is pretty nifty. So it is all enemies take 10 damage. It is worth noting, this damage can be evaded. It can be decreased by tough or plated or fortress, but it can also be increased by shocked or vulnerable or crystallized. It's all enemies take 10, 15, or 20 damage, and then you heal equal to the damage dealt. Because of how much damage this is, in a multi-enemy fight, even if they have like tough or fortress, usually you're going to get enough health back to heal to full, unless this coincides with like an Idol of the Hunt, everything is evading thing. So this is kind of a nice thing, just like surprise, you get a bunch of healing, you do an okay amount of damage, just handy. So that's Idol of the Hunger. 3 down, 2 to go. Gonna get this in about an hour, it looks like. Idol of the Hunt. You invoke the Spirit of the Hunt, reducing your fatigue threshold by 1. So by default, that means that now instead of fatigue every 5 cards, you get a fatigue rank every 4 cards. You can increase your fatigue threshold up again if you get lucky enough and roll the appropriate idol buff. It can also be reduced if you decide to take Arcane Belt. If you're an absolute mad lad, you can end up with a fatigue threshold of 3 by taking that item. And then you just be sad, especially because the Idol of the Hunt combat passive is enemies are going to start combat with ranks of Opportunist. Number of ranks depends on the area, 2, 3, or 4. A reminder, Opportunist did change this patch. Opportunist means that once you get a rank of fatigue by drawing cards, the front enemy with Opportunist will take an action, and it will lose a rank of Opportunist. So it will take an action, it will change to the next action as though it had taken a turn, and it will lose a rank of Opportunist. The other thing is you lose half of your ranks of Opportunist rounded up at the start of each turn. Or enemies do, I guess. The player can't get Opportunist. Which means the player will end up... which means that in Area 1, that means 2 turns you'll have to wait out the Opportunist. Or in Area 1 and 2, that's 2 turns to wait out the initial Opportunist. In Area 3, that is 3 turns before all the Opportunists will decay if you are avoiding tripping it. Because on turn 1, it goes from 4 to 2. Turn 2, it goes from 2 to 1. So turn 1 goes from 4 to 2. Turn 2 goes from 2 to 1. Turn 3 goes from 1 to 0. So 3 turns to wait out the Opportunist. Assuming you don't bait out any Opportunist attacks early, which tends to be pretty painful unless you have frozen the thing in question. So the Idol of the Hunt active cards. The first one, all enemies gain hidden and then divide Opportunists equally among them, 3, 4, or 5. The important note here is this is not temporary Opportunist. So this 5 Opportunist will take so long to decay in depth 3 because it goes from 5 so it takes another 3 turns to decay. So if you get this card in the first 3 turns in area 5 against a single enemy, that means you are now dealing with Opportunist for the first 6 turns if you can't afford to trip Opportunist, which means that in particular, this makes Hunt Baelator very painful for decks that are counting on card draw. If you know you're going up against Baelator and you know that Hunt is active in area 3, you want to make sure you are not reliant on having to draw a bunch of cards to get going, because you just will not be able to afford to draw cards in your early turns unless you can take an extra turn worth of Baelator stuff, and that's a big ask. The next one, you and all allies take 2x4, 2x5, or 2x6 damage. This is an annoyance because it eats up any non-temporary evasion you have, but this is obviously much, much lower than the Idol of Hunger damage. Even the top tier here is only 12, whereas Idol of Hunger is 25. This is less than half as much. And also, this can be reduced by tough or other things, which means it's pretty common for this to be like 1x4, 1x5, 1x6. The next one, Idol of the Hunt, gives you... I keep wanting to say like the card name, but they all have the name of the idol. But so this one, bleed 2, 3, 4. Obnoxious, but no, it's just obnoxious. Bleed is pretty painful. Like I mentioned that the Hunger one, there are ways to use it. And I do stand by the fact that I don't think it's as bad as the Cruelty Arcane Leak card. But the bleed absolutely could be a day ruiner if you have a hand that wants to play a decent amount of cards. Here's one of the Hunt remove cards. This is divide evasion and powerful among all enemies. So the evasion 4 is usually pretty manageable for most decks. It's worth noting this evasion 4, this is the only non-temporary evasion the idol hands out. So this is a one-time gift of non-temporary evasion, and it is only 4 ranks even at the 3rd tier. But that powerful 8 absolutely can make solo fights much more painful, especially if in like a 2 idol fight where you have Idol of Hunt and Idol of Endurance, and it's just surprise the enemy has 16 powerful on turn 2, and then you're big sad. Or you're doing 3 idols because you're doing 5 idol, and you've got Hunger, and now they have the 6 powerful from that, and now they are at 22 powerful on turn at the end of turn 1, and that is not fun. You're never dispelling all of that off. So, next, the Void Stone, or the Idol Stone. Although, this one is not an Idol Stone, this is a summon. I don't actually have a picture of the doggo itself, because that's like the only monster I don't have an asset art for, and by the time I realized it, I didn't want to bother one day about getting the asset for that. But, so you summon an enemy Void Stalker, which will summon to the front of the enemies. If there's no room for the Void Stalker, the card is still removed, and the other part of this is that all enemies gain Pack Tactics. But this does mean that ideally, if you are fighting Hunt and you are doing a fight that is full, you do not want to kill any enemies until after you've seen this card. Because you ideally want not to fight the Void Stalker if you don't have to, just because it has a decent amount of health. And so if you're fighting something like Treants or... Treants is the big one. Just because that's the main one I can think of where you've got like 2 big enemies. Or Vessels of Corruption, I guess, is the other one. Where you have 2 large enemies. And so those getting Pack Tactics and then not having to deal with the Void Stalker is generally better. Most decks, or a lot of decks, I guess, this isn't really a consideration you're making just because like it takes you enough time to kill the enemies that either you see this or you don't. But something to keep in mind if you're fighting Idol of the Hunt is to strategically sometimes leave enemies alive to dodge Void Stalker. The Void Stalker itself isn't that dangerous. It hits, but it does always attack for like something X3 every single turn. So if you don't have to deal with it, you may as well not. This one is one of the silver cards that is just one of the most double-edged swords. That I think is one of the more more like perfectly balanced between Hunt Silver cards are pretty perfectly balanced between good and bad for the player. Because this one is everyone gains ambush 3, or everyone gets ambush and critical, or everyone gets even more ambush and even more critical. So, of course, Endurance has a nasty habit of giving out Purity on the same turn to negate the ambush on enemies. But if there is Endurance in the fight, enemies aren't otherwise able to get Purity, then this just basically means everyone is doing guaranteed crits for the next 2 turns. However, as the player, you can always Arcane Detonate off the critical on the enemies and cleanse off the ambush on you, and now you get free crits and they don't, and you get to laugh. And in general, just you're going to be better able to use having guaranteed crits. So this tends to be very, very powerful for the player. The other one is everyone gets evasion 4 this turn. This is unique as being the only idol card that does not change depending on the depth. These are technically 3 different cards in the collection, but all of them have the identical effect of 4 evasion. And this is one that I think is slightly tilted towards the player, but is overall pretty balanced, depending on your deck. You know, it can be very annoying that everyone gets evasion 4 this turn, but this can also save you a lot of incoming damage. If you're fighting Baelator, you love to see this card because this is a free turn. And when Baelator is sitting over there threatening to do 60x4, just not having to worry about it for a turn, super nice. Idol of the Hunt's gold card is arguably the strongest gold card. It gives you Frenzy. There's a reason it comes with downsides, which is that in Area 1 you get Weak 2 and Bleed 2. In Area 2 you get Weak 1 and Bleed 1. But in Area 3 you just straight up get the Frenzy. And Frenzy is obviously very powerful. That's a full extra turn. Cruelty is a huge scroll, though. And so if you have Hunt Cruelty, what will sometimes happen is Hunt will be like, here, have a Frenzy. And Cruelty will be like, apply Arcane to you. Take your Frenzy away. And you will be really, really unhappy. But if that doesn't happen, you're in good shape. So that is Idol of the Hunt done. So the last one, Whiteflame Idol. Global passive is to invoke the spirit of the Whiteflame Bear, forcing you to choose 2 charged common cards when you start a run. I believe there are 11 different charged cards. I may have miscounted. Each charged card is a weaker version of a generic common card. So for example, Charred Mend is 2 mana for heal 9 instead of 2 mana for heal 12. Charged cards cannot be upgraded or removed. And similar to a normal card choice reward, you will be presented with 3 different charged cards to choose between. So when you start the run, I don't think I've ever gotten a chance to take the same charged card twice, but I don't know if that's guaranteed to be different or not. And it's possible I have, and I just don't remember. But yeah, so the charged cards can't be upgraded or removed. They're just kind of stuck in your deck. And sometimes it's kind of nice to just you just take a charged Mend, you just have a bit of guaranteed healing, or you take a charged Hobble, and you have some extra weak. But yeah, that is the global passive. This is a bit unique in that it is a thing that affects your deck, but does not really affect the fights in the run. The combat passive, enemies start combat with ranks of Whiteflame, which is kind of the signature buff of the Whiteflame Idol. The number of ranks depends on the area. Area 1 is 2, Area 2 it is 3, Area 3 it is 4. So Whiteflame is a buff that increases the damage and status dealt by 5% per rank that the thing has. So if an enemy has 4 ranks of Whiteflame, they do 4 times 5 is 20% more damage. The other part of it is whenever something with Whiteflame is hit by an attack, so this is basically if the attack would have resulted in the attacker taking reflect damage, then it will use up a stack of Whiteflame and deal 5 damage to all of whoever was that had Whiteflame's enemies. So if a monster with Whiteflame is attacked, they lose a rank. The player and all the player's allies take damage. If the player has Whiteflame and the player is attacked, they lose a rank of Whiteflame and all monsters take 5 damage. This can make attacking into Whiteflame pretty dangerous. It can make cards that attack on draw, like Perfected Strike or Blade Idol, somewhat risky because you will just surprise take damage. Whiteflame does decrease each turn, unlike Crystallize. It used to not, but it does now. And so that is a thing to know. So let's get into the comments. So first off, the removed card is relatively weak. It is 40, 70, 100 heal, which is obviously the reason it is So the reason that this one is removed is so that enemies don't just stack up a ton of heal. There were points during the beta where the idols were handing out a bunch of defense, and you would just end up with these obnoxious fights where you'd be, 10 turns in, the enemies would have 300 shield on them, and you'd just be super frustrated. So that's why healing and shield and such, those cards are removed. So the other ones, this is one of the cards that puts Whiteflame on enemies. This one divides Whiteflame among enemies and also gives them Fortress. So similar to the Endurance card, which I think is powerful, is divided. It was powerful and Fortress. The Whiteflame here is divided and the Fortress is not. Each enemy gets the full amount of Fortress, always. But the Whiteflame is divided. This is a thing that you do have to keep to deal with, but I want to say this card was nerfed pretty severely from where it was at in beta, but maybe I'm just misremembering it. But this does mean that, for example, if you're fighting a single enemy, this is now potentially up to 40 damage that you could be taking from attacking into that enemy, so be aware of that. For these, this one is you cleanse all enemies 2 times, and it's 2 times regardless of which area you're in, and then they're going to get burned too. And then in area 1 they get tough. In area 2 they get tough and mighty. In areas 2 and 3 they get tough and mighty. They just get more of it in area 3. So this double cleanse is why running debuff decks into Whiteflame tends to be kind of annoying. Curse decks in particular, which is the debuff that you're most likely to want to just stack a bunch of ranks on the enemy, because Whiteflame will just take away a bunch of your curse stacks every so often. And that can make getting through especially bigger enemies like Baelator or Maw really, really obnoxious. Or things like Crystal Dragon or Valley Guardians that can cleanse themselves as well. It just makes that particularly obnoxious. So if you see Whiteflame, you may not want to play a curse-focused deck. Basically is the point. And also, just in general, if you see Whiteflame, you may not want to prioritize curse-based cards in Area 3 as much as you might otherwise. The other one, the player gets Burn and Weak, or Burn in Area 1. In Area 2, it's Burn, Weak, and Vulnerable. In Area 3, it's Burn, Weak, Vulnerable, and Fatigue. So you'll start your turn, and all the cards you draw that turn, all the non-mana cards you draw that turn will cost more. Isn't that lovely? No, it isn't. So the Idol Stone for Whiteflame is the Bright Flame Stone. This one is a little annoying, but it's not too big of a deal. So whenever you play another non-mana card while you are holding a Bright Flame Stone, a random enemy will get Whiteflame 1, and you will get 1 mana. So you theoretically can use Bright Flame Stone to build up mana at the cost of giving out a bunch of Whiteflame. But it is worth noting, Bright Flame Stone is not unplayable. You can play this out of your hand whenever you want to. And the progression on this is shuffle 1 in your deck, put 1 on top, and then shuffle 1 in your deck and put 1 in your discard. So you won't have to worry about drawing 2 of them in Area 3, which is something. But overall, this tends to be fairly easy to manage. It's a minor nuisance, but it's not directly a threat to you in the same way the Insidious... Oh, the other thing I didn't mention on the Insidious one is one of the ways the Insidious Stone can get you is that it will result in you drawing more cards than you expected and tripping Opportunist suddenly. So that's the thing to be careful of there. This warning for the Idol of Hunger brought to you in the middle of the Whiteflame Idol description. Sorry. So, the silver cards. The first one's reduce all statuses on everyone by 10, 15, or 20, and then everyone gains powerful 2 or 3. So, this is largely the upshot of this is just the powerful stacking. The status reduction usually is a little bit better for the player because it's rare that you are playing cards where you are really caring about the trace status left behind on enemies. Direct Ray is basically the only one where you're really sad about that. But everyone getting powerful, one of those things where it's helpful to you, but it also hurts. The other silver card, though, gives you some Whiteflame, but also gives a decent amount of Whiteflame to enemies. This card in particular was a culprit of how difficult Whiteflame used to be in Area 3 because you would get 10 Whiteflame on enemies and used to, it was tripped whenever the enemy lost health, not whenever they were attacked. And so it was really easy to end up just eating a 50 damage worth of Whiteflame procs that you just didn't have a great way to avoid. Oh, but it's probably not as big of a deal anymore, but it is absolutely something to be careful of. If you're playing a deck that is directly attacking, make sure you have enough shield to compensate for all of this Whiteflame that enemies are potentially picking up. The Whiteflame Gold card is a little more situational than the others. It cleanses you 2 times, 2 times, or 3 times, and it heals you for 6, 12, or 12, and it gives you some Whiteflame and some burn. The burn is a pretty negligible drawback. The cleanse can be an absolute lifesaver against the Modified or Vessels of Corruption, for example. But the heal can also be pretty nice. Gaining the Whiteflame tends to be relatively low value. I find that protecting Whiteflame on the player is pretty difficult, but that is effectively some AoE damage, which, you know, isn't bad. And then, yeah, that's just what it is. I think this is obviously like quite a bit weaker than the Frenzy that you get from Idol of Hunt, for example. But it is probably about on par with the Idol of Hunger's like damage and heal. So anyway, that is all of the idols that exist right now. I do know that One Day is working on more for future updates, but those are currently not yet nightmares that we must face. So I hope you found this at least somewhat informative. I will, yes. This is, like, subscribe, the YouTube stuff. Leave me comments if you want to see more. If you don't want to see more, I guess. Probably going to keep making these. They're a lot of effort, though. But I may or may not actually do. I do want to do at some point a video that's going to be the reward cards as well. Just talking over how I feel about those. And once again, see the description for a link to my patch breakdown video for the patch as a whole, and also for a link to my short video on explaining how you unlock the ability to get 4 and 5 shrines. That's it for this one. I will see you next time. Toodles.